Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about analytics in the enterprise, specifically some of the cultural and organizational challenges involved with data analytics, as opposed to merely the technical challenges. To discuss that, I'm joined by Kimberly Nevala, Strategic Advisor at SAS. Kimberly, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for the invite. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I've got some great, important, complicated questions. But before all that, Kimberly, I want to ask, are you keeping up with it all? Because we're here in the holiday season. These days are moving very, very fast. How's it going for you?
Yeah, they are moving fast. Even I'm a fast talker, so I like things that move at speed. But I was a little shocked to find it was December 1st. So I'm looking forward to slowing down a little into the end of the year here. But it's been a crazy couple of years. So to some extent, I think that hectic happy is just a nice place to be. So
Right. It has been a crazy couple of years, and we do have to wonder, like here in early December, where did the year go? But all we can do is go forward. So um, let's look at what's going on in the marketplace these days. I mean, what is your sense of how companies are navigating the challenges of data analytics these days? I mean, I think it's not really a new technology, but I think some companies seem to be still grappling with it, to be sure. Is that your sense, or are things going better than I think?
I think we are still grappling with it. And frankly, that is probably the expectation we should have now and in the future. But overall, relative to adoption and how people, I think, have reacted even through the pandemic, it is a bit of a mixed bag. And we've seen some striking differences in adoption, even amongst similar companies within industries. And frankly, sometimes even within the walls of a single organization. So clearly, the pandemic threw an outsized monkey wrench into business operations, and digitally native or digitally intensive businesses did have a bit of a leg up, as they do for the most part have somewhat native and robust data analytics capabilities. Mm-hmm. But even those entities, because they often rely on very advanced machine learning or deep learning models, really did feel the sting when all of those predictable patterns that those systems depend on to make those predictions and recommendations no longer existed. So as advanced as those AI technologies are, they can't predict a future that has never existed before. Interestingly, it wasn't necessarily the companies, whether they're big or small, that had the most advanced analytics capabilities or AI and ML in operations that did the best. It was the companies that had the most diverse analytics portfolios. So they were able to go back and leverage a number of techniques, things like data mining, other approaches, to quickly explore, to generate hypotheses, and react to this changing environment. And I think you see that.
Quick question, when you say diverse, what do you mean diverse in what sense here?
So diverse in that we're not just dependent on a single type of analytics, right? It's not just data mining. It's not just machine learning. It's not just deep learning. It's not just optimization and forecasting techniques. It's not just a certain type of analytic model or algorithm. Folks that really have a breadth of capabilities, from both what we used to call descriptive analytics, right? Dashboarding, being able to report, to predictive and prescriptive analytics, things like forecasting and then optimization. We're able to go back and pick and choose and mix and match those capabilities to adapt to the changing data and environments. AI and ML, as I said, they always predict the past. These are really powerful machines, but they look for patterns, and they only understand the patterns that are in the data, which is the only reality they know in the data they're exposed to. And that means that the only patterns they can respond to is what's happened in the past. So when the current or the future that we're predicting doesn't match, these things break down very quickly. And this is where we need to go back to sort of old school techniques like just data mining to look at and try to understand what are some of the new trends and things that are popping up. And that need for a heterogeneous ecosystem, and you'll sometimes hear it called composite analytics, or more frequently composite AI, is going to be critical moving forward. And it certainly proved its worth and value in the last year or two.
It's a really interesting point you make in terms of data analytics struggles with the idea of looking to the future, because it gives its points, it gives its conclusions based on what's happened in the past. What if we're going into a business environment we've never seen before, which we have done, and we certainly will do in the years ahead? I mean, What is the answer there for an executive, someone in the C-suite who has to say, hey, we want to predict what's going on. This information is backward looking. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to think about this. One of the things, and I do talk to folks a lot about things like AI and specifically like machine learning, deep learning, and some of the issues that we see with these systems today is, again, that they're dependent on patterns. So they're smart, but they're not necessarily creative. And I use this very stupid example where I always order, coffee, at Starbucks. I live in Seattle, or I order tea. And so the system can see if my pattern of buying is changing, and I now look less like someone who always buys, the cohort that buys coffee, and I now look more like the cohort that buys tea. The system isn't going to do as well. Maybe you should really move into frothy mixed drinks, right? It's sort of non-dairy drinks. It doesn't exist. So this is that integration, I think, of both the human perspective and experience and the machine being able to surface a trend or a prediction, or look at what's happening and be able to say, this is out of bounds. It doesn't actually match with what we need to do. So one of the things I think for organizations to think about is we're not necessarily always using analytics and AI enabled or driven capabilities in particular to give us the answer or to give us a perfect answer. Sometimes it's just giving us a perspective, and then we need to look at it and say, does that actually reflect the population, the environment, or the culture that we want to see in the future, and make our changes accordingly. So it's really important that we deploy these systems to do what they're good at and understand where the limitations are. And during the pandemic, it was interesting as well, because we've gotten in the habit of thinking things are pretty consistent, right? How do people buy toilet paper? That's the obvious example. Well, that changed fairly rapidly, and organizations, retailers, manufacturers thought about forecasting demand out in quarters and years, right? 2 years, 3 years. Well, now that has fundamentally changed. And so organizations that had good base capabilities started to actually shrink the timeframes that they were using. So we're not trying to predict things anymore based on the last year for the next year. We're basing on the last 2 weeks for the next 2 weeks. And that's a very rapid process. And you have to sort of, it's the same basic mechanics, but on a much more rapid scale. And that requires a slightly different organizational agility and flexibility. The other thing, and I think this also was something that we've seen over the course of the pandemic, is that we started to look at different data sources. So I was talking to someone from a healthcare provider, and they said, we started to predict what might be influxes or spikes in transmission in COVID based on looking at Department of Transportation data about how congested the roads were. So all of this has underscored, another sort of fundamental truth, which is we have to have foundational elements, things like data management and data engineering. And that same gentleman, he's the chief data scientist from the Cleveland Clinic, had this really interesting perspective. I asked him, what's the most transformative technology you've seen, throughout this process and in his career? And he's been around, a long, long time. And he said it was actually the data model.
Wow.
Data model, right? The humble data model. And he said, because it allowed us to rapidly integrate and normalize new data sources from diverse places and even bring new ones in and then not have to reinvent those wheels multiple times. So, I think it's interesting. We're learning a lot of lessons about foundational capabilities that allow us to then ramp up and then be sort of resilient and flexible and nimble when things change. So.
Really interesting about the data model and how important it is, that the humble data model.
Yeah.
I mean, there was something you said that really piqued my interest in terms of looking ahead. The data may be backward looking. Of course, we're using more recent data, but I think at one point you said, well, we've got to look at that, and you say, put that in context. My real question is, it sounds like there will never be a point where the human intuition and judgment and creativity will get out of the process. I mean, I think sometimes the data analytics folks go, well, we really need to make all the decisions based on metrics, when, we're still kind of using gut instinct. And I guess my question is, will gut instinct ever go away? It's an impossible question, but I ask it of you anyways.
No, it's fair. Because I think there is, when we think gut instinct, I think we tend to almost look at that as a negative, because what we tend to say is that is a perspective where somebody is going to move forward in an uninformed way, just based on what they think. And I think that sort of debate or tension that we bring about between data-driven decision-making, if you will, another term that I have a number of problems with, but and sort of gut decision-making is a bit of a false dilemma, because one of the things, again, that we can see with these systems is it will show us, there's been a lot of talk about AI and ML, for instance, exasperating bias, but it can also identify bias, because when the system comes forward and we go, wow, those results are biased, we go, wait a minute, we didn't actually know we were doing that. In a lot of cases, it was completely unintentional. Cases it wasn't, but in a lot of cases it was. So to me, it's about applying our ability to be creative, to pull in information that's outside of the system's wherewithal. So the worldview and the experience, and I don't like to anthropomorphize these too much, but the experience of these systems is reflected in that data. We have the ability to bring in experience and perspective that's outside the realm of that sort of systems models worldview, if you will, and use that to make judgments. So I prefer to think about this as an informed judgment, where we are using the systems to maybe highlight issues or maybe even bring forward perspectives that we wouldn't have considered. And then we're laying that with other informed judgments to move forward. I don't think we can expect these systems, though, reasonably to tell us and decide. So people will talk about, what does the future of work look like, right? How do we want to operate as a society in the future? It's not up to these systems to imagine and project that future for us. That's our job as humans, to figure out what that is and then bring those systems to bear to enable it. But a bit of a soapbox, I'll step up.
I like the sound of that. I've got this question that probably could call for a 5-hour answer. So it's almost an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. So what do you see as a cultural and organizational challenge to getting AI to getting analytics to work, as opposed to just a technical challenge? And I think the answer to that could be really long, but I'll ask it, what's a cultural challenge going on here?
So I think to some extent that it's simply complex, but I think that if we want to get more out of anything, whether it's traditional analytics software, whether it's AI and ML, the conversation cannot begin with the software, right? It's not about going out and asking, do you need a new dashboard? You want AI? I have AI, right? That's taking a hammer and looking for nails. We have to start with literacy. It's about education, and it's education for everybody, not just decision makers. So we need to start to demonstrate the art of the possible to everyone in an organization. We need to teach them basic number sense, right? How do you interpret basic information? I am always somewhat flabbergasted when we talk to folks about, for instance, their own performance metrics, right? Do they even know how those numbers are calculated? What might throw them off? How accurate they are, how sensitive they are. A lot of people don't, and that's driving your pay, it's driving your promotion. So we need folks to understand what analytics can do. They need to know the types of problems it can solve. They need to know the questions it can answer, or the questions it should raise, to the discussion we just had, the perspectives it can unveil. And the more we do that, the more uptake and the more sort of smart adoption we're going to get of these technologies. We also need to make sure, and again, we talked about this a little bit, the objective here when we're doing this work is not always about giving the right answer or the perfect answer. We shouldn't be going to those teams and saying, tell me what the answer is. We're looking for information. It should be, tell me what the data is telling me. Help me understand where that data came from, how it was collected, for what purpose, and how the model itself works, so that I can make the right decision with it or apply it in the right way. And lastly, I think this, again, is so simple and we don't do it enough, but we're getting much better at it, is we just need to listen to what people need. Ask what analytics you want to have. Ask what questions are you pondering. Ask what information would you like to have access to? What are you thinking about, or would you like to know as you go about making a decision or trying to do your day-to-day work? And absolutely everybody in the organization, whether it's an operator on a manufacturing line, whether it's a customer service rep, or it's an executive, can absolutely tell you what problems they face in their day-to-day work. And going about the conversation that way is not only going to help surface actual germane business problems that people care about solving. It really ensures that the folks who are ultimately tasked in adopting and using those solutions will in fact use them. And I had a global chief data officer, and this is a multinational corporation, say to me once, we come up with billion-dollar ideas in our advanced analytics center every day.
Mhm.
And most of those end up being worth zero because they don't solve a problem someone in the enterprise cares about. So at the end of the day, it's simple. It's something that we talk about a lot, but we need to reinforce. And it absolutely starts with education and literacy. So people understand what they cannot do with these systems, and they begin to actively ask for them and engage with them.
All right. So education is a key part of this process.
Yes.
Where does that education come from? Is it companies giving workshops to their own employees, or how do the workers learn?
Yeah, I think there's probably multiple. I think it's a multi-dimensional issue. I think organizations are more and more developing these programs and bringing in-house training to their workforces. And we see things, I mean, organizations or entities as diverse as the Air Force to manufacturers that are doing in-house training curricula, if you will. We at SAS have a whole program around various aspects of data literacy, data analytics, AI, ML, for different levels of users and different contexts. So I think that's a good one. I think some of it happens in on-the-job training. So as we think about how do we organize ourselves, one of the things I think we'll increasingly see is that our data and analytics folks are not separate or adjacent to our products teams or our business operation teams. They're integrated to it. And that cross-pollination of that discussion just sort of lifts the boat for everyone. So the business folks get more conversant in data and analytics and modeling, and the modeling folks get more conversant in the business. I'm also a huge fan of really getting out there. There's a lot of great online courses available today that can get people up to speed very quickly, again, at multiple different levels. Happy to share some resources for your viewers after as well. And things like conferences. So I think it's a multidimensional program. And if we're doing this well in an organization, it'll be a multi-pronged approach. And I spoke with Giselle Moda recently. She's currently a principal at the Future of Work at ADP. And she talked about the idea of employee journeys, right? The idea that we think about customer journeys, but we don't necessarily think about employee journeys and how we're going to train folks for what comes next in their job and in the world at large. And so I think we need to lean back into that concept as well.
It's really interesting. Well, you mentioned SAS. Let's take a look exactly at the SAS portfolio. What's a tool or an application from SAS that really makes a difference? What would you point to?
Yeah, I think folks may or may not be aware of our VIA platform, and we're really proud of it. We've worked very hard on it. It's our cloud native data and analytics platform. I think it has a number of standout features, but I'll call out two that I think are probably most important, at least from the perspective of the area that I work in. One is that the platform caters to users at various levels. So whether you may be a data scientist, you want to really dive in, get into the meat of it, get into the code up to your elbows, you can do that. But if you don't have that level of skill, or frankly, the desire to do so, and this is going to be most of your workforce, and you might want to come back on this idea of digital democratization, because I think it's something getting wrong.
Huge.
You can still quickly generate models against the data using an intuitive point and click interface. And the platform can do things like suggest likely models based on the contours of the input data. It can compare different models, and it will describe for you in plain English, or in plain language, I should say, the results of the model. So this goes a long way towards making analytics and data analytics more accessible. I do want to put out a cautionary tale, though, that this is not a feature. This feature doesn't negate the need for training and literacy.
Yes.
Anyone generating a model has to understand at a logical level how that algorithm works. And too often I hear people talking about this move to low code or no code as a panacea for the lack of skilled data scientists. But I would say in the same way that we wouldn't put a new driver in a car and just let them loose without making sure that they understand the mechanics of the car, right? What's a gas pedal and the steering wheel? What are the rules of the road? And how should you operate? And what are your expectations as an operator? When's it going to work well and when shouldn't it, right? We also can't just let users loose on these types of self-analytics platform or self-service platforms, whether it's BI or AI, without that level of training and consistency. It is really easy, even for skilled data scientists, to make mistakes and for these systems to go awry, despite our best intentions. So it's really incumbent on us, if we're going to make those capabilities available, to make sure that people really understand how to use them properly when they're going right, and how to know when they might be going wrong.
It's interesting about the low code, no code, because we hear so much about it, and it is the panacea. Like, oh, well, low code, no code is part of the democratization of technology. Everyone's going to be building software. But I mean, of course, you're very right. I mean, no matter how intuitive the no code, low code platform is, it's still challenging to, build a data application. I mean, no matter how easy it is to code it. Uh, Speaking of which, I think it brings us to the future, because we're talking about low code, no code, and the democratization of technology. What do you see as the near to midterm future of analytics? I mean, what are some milestones that companies can be ready for?
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe I'm a very poor futurist. So in terms of milestones, I think there's really exciting things on a strictly technical front. We're looking at advances in like machine learning, deep learning that support things like training models with much less data, making this more accessible, not just to the digital giants. We're looking at distributed learning techniques that allow us to pool and leverage sort of collective intelligence from across time and space. Has really important, I think, implications for things like clinical trials, and also privacy preservation, the application and integration of AR, VR, et cetera. So I think there's really exciting opportunities for us to truly help the planet, address climate change, and hopefully make society more accessible and engaging for everybody, regardless of their ability, their background, their socioeconomic status, whatnot. But there's work, I think, for organizations to do to capitalize on that. First, as we've mentioned a little bit, we need to stop thinking about data and analytics. And I'm hoping to see this now. I think we're making the turn from data and analytics as being separate from our products and services, or separate from our business operations. They need to be integral. They are integral to them, and they're ambient and embedded. And that has ramifications for everything about how we organize teams. We mentioned before, embedding those teams together, to how we think about who is accountable for things like an AI-enabled product, right? We need to shift that data democratization conversation from just providing tools for people to create insight to thinking about data democratization as giving people access to insight that they may or may not be creating for themselves. So we're providing data where and when people need it and humans need it in a format that's appropriate for them and their context of use. And we have to get much smarter about what data we collect and under what pretenses, and how and where the insight we derive from that is applied. Because as we talked about earlier, there are so many powerful applications of this technology, but the data is very often a limitation, and it's not one that we think about enough. So in the near term, things like decision intelligence and literacy. And, last but not least, and I think we're going to hear a lot of discussion in the short term, but I think in the medium term, I'm hopeful we're going to see this very distinct shift in prioritizing things like rights-based or responsible innovation and ESG-driven perspectives with our more traditional profit or other business objectives. And I bring that up here because I think while this is larger than analytics, this is the mind shift. It might be the most critical mind shift to ensure that we are all creating an AI-enabled or a technically immersive future that really elevates the human experience for everybody. So.
Kimberly, I think you said it. I mean, that's some great stuff. I very much appreciate you sharing your expertise today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It was great.
Appreciate the opportunity.